House Democrats have delayed a resolution that would condemn anti-Semitism after recent comments from Minnesota Democratic Congresswoman Ilhan Omar. The freshman member of Congress, who is one of two Muslim women in the House, drew criticism for comments about Israel. Here's what she said at an event in Washington last week.
I want to talk about the political influence in this country that says it is okay for people to push for allegiance to a foreign country.
Congresswoman Omar apologized earlier this year for tweets that critics called anti-Semitic. But Omar has generally stood by her comments about the relationship between the U.S. and Israel. A vote on the resolution is expected as soon as tomorrow. The resolution does not mention Congresswoman Omar by name. It has also been expanded to include condemnation of bias against Muslims. Democratic Congresswoman and House Progressive Caucus Chairwoman Pramila Jayapal defended Omar today.
Representative Omar is under a microscope in a way that many Republicans have been able to say things and get away with them that are also anti-Semitic, and yet they haven't necessarily been called to the mat. And so I do think we have to do multiple things at once. We have, as I said, already passed a resolution around anti-Semitism. I'm not sure that we need to continue to do this every single time, but we can make sure that we speak against anti-Semitism. We have to make sure we speak against Islamophobia.
As New York Times congressional correspondent Sheryl Gay Stolberg writes, the fight over this resolution reveals a generational split in the Democratic Party. And Sheryl Gay Stolberg joins me now from Capitol Hill. Sheryl, thanks so much for joining us. I know it is always a busy time there, so I appreciate you
for having me.
being with us. First of all, explain this generational divide that you write about.
So I think what we're seeing is an older generation of Democrats, many of them Jewish, who have very strong support for Israel, coming up against a younger generation of progressives, many of them young Jews, who are very critical of the Netanyahu government in Israel and are increasingly willing to accuse Israel of human rights abuses. So you have this kind of tug in the Democratic Party, and I think Ilhan Omar represents that younger generation. There are few Ilhan Omars in Congress. Not that many lawmakers are willing to openly criticize Israel as harshly as she has. But you see it in the Democratic grassroots. And so there's this divide within the Congress, within the Democratic caucus, but also between the older members of the conference, the caucus, and the grassroots.
Well, our Caitlin Huey-Burns interviewed Democratic Representative Seth Moulton today and asked him about the resolution, and I want to play some of his answer.
I suspect that the entire House will vote for this resolution because it's important to put a marker in the sand that anti-Semitism won't be tolerated. We also voted to censure Representative King when he made comments supporting white supremacy, and the comments that have made against my colleague that are anti-Muslim should be condemned as well. We need a return to civility in politics where we can respect differences and have a debate, but we don't slander folks, groups, and we don't attack individuals. And I think that's exactly what our Democratic leadership is trying to do with this resolution.
So it's interesting, Sheryl, we heard Congressman Moulton frame Congresswoman Omar's remarks about Israel as anti-Semitism. Do most Democrats you've spoken to view it that way?
I think many Democrats do believe that Ms. Omar's comments play into anti-Semitic tropes, that the suggestion of dual loyalty, of Jews having allegiance to a foreign country, or that allegiance motivating their stance on Israel, is kind of this centuries-old canard about Jews being more loyal to Israel than to, or to their faith than to their home country. So I think that Democrats are concerned about that, but you also have this uprising of concern about treatment that Ms. Omar herself has experienced, anti-Muslim treatment. And so what we're seeing now in the House is this move to expand the resolution to include mention of all forms of hatred, anti-Muslim bias, Islamophobia, homophobia, xenophobia, as someone said earlier, all the isms, racism. And as a result, this resolution is being redrafted, and we don't actually know when the vote will be right now. Steny Hoyer, the number 2 Democrat in the House, told us this morning that a date for this vote had not been set. And Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker, faced a lot of pushback in a closed-door meeting this morning with her Democratic members.
Interesting. Well, last month, Congresswoman Omar deleted a tweet that said American support for Israel is, quote, all about the Benjamins, referring to funding by the American Israel Public Affairs Committee, or AIPAC. You wrote this week that Omar's criticism has revived a debate over AIPAC's influence. So where does AIPAC's influence stand among politicians in both parties?
Well, I think that people in Washington generally agree that AIPAC is a very powerful and influential group, although it's important to note that AIPAC does not donate to candidates and does not endorse candidates. AIPAC is a lobbying organization, and they've got a lot of members. When they have their conference this month in Washington, their annual policy conference, more than 18,000 people will come. A lot of members of Congress are going to come from both parties, including the leadership. So AIPAC has a lot of clout. AIPAC's clout, though, has been diminishing, especially with the rise of what we talked about earlier, these young progressives who are more willing to be critical of Israel. And we're seeing other groups grow up, like J Street, which is a liberal political action committee, a Jewish political action committee. And they are drawing away membership, Democrats, from AIPAC.
All right. Always a very busy time there on Capitol Hill. A lot of interesting dynamics on your beat. Sheryl Gay Stolberg, thanks so much for joining us.
Yes.